So I want to spend just a few minutes talking about the November 2020 election, but the context is really going to be coronavirus because there's a very interesting new study which found that if you break down Donald Trump's approval rating in counties where coronavirus is raging versus in counties where it is not, this is a county level analysis. Counties that are seeing the highest rates of coronavirus explosion have seen a dramatic drop in Donald Trump's approval rating. And the reason this is important is that last week I did a segment pointing out that, when we think about the Biden versus Trump debates, assuming that they happen, Biden pointing out that Trump is crass and makes fun of people and is a bully and grab him by the you know what and the racism and the xenophobia and all of that stuff. It hasn't worked so far, and I can't imagine that it's going to all of a sudden start working for Joe Biden if that's the approach he decides to take. My instinct was we've seen Trump's approval come down because of three major issues over the last 4 months. Number one, the handling of coronavirus. Number two, the handling of the economy in the context of the failed handling of coronavirus. And number three, the insane reaction to protests against police brutality, which included authoritarian anti-speech tendencies and threats to send in troops with even more force to protests that are against police brutality to begin with. That's where the focus should be, and particularly the failure of leadership. Language aside, if Trump uses coarse language, but he crushes the virus and does the right thing when it comes to protests and the economy, okay, who's going to care about the coarse language? And that's basically my idea. And indeed, Donald Trump has seen the fastest declines in his approval rating in the 500 counties where there have been more than 28 coronavirus deaths per 100,000 residents. That's sort of like the dividing line. Pew Research polling shows that 17% of the country, which approved of Trump in March, now disapproves. So it's starting with just the slice that approved in March. 17% of that now disapproves. And this is in those counties. And this is a massive drop. And we're not even near the end of the pandemic. And it's always tragic when it takes friends or family members getting sick or dying to wake up and have a realization. It's like the anti-gay Republican politician who changes their tune, typically his tune, but their tune, when someone they know comes out as gay. Great, they came to the right conclusion, but why did it take that? You couldn't empathize? Well, it seems like that's at least part of what's going on here. And there's a very reasonable debate over how much is Trump's fault in terms of the cases and deaths. Obviously, people were going to die. You can't say of the 132,000 deaths, 132,000 are Trump's fault. But you can put numbers on what was the cost of not developing a testing program starting January 20th, the way South Korea did when we both got our first cases on the same day. You can make estimates about what would a mask recommendation have done early on. What would stay at home have done early on? Hospitals could have maybe not been underwhelmed, like you overwhelmed. You can put numbers to this. And so, people who want to argue, Trump doesn't have 132,000 deaths on his hands. Of course he doesn't. I don't know anyone who's actually making that case. What we know is that there are specific policies and specific actions, including the rollout of the testing program and many other things that could have been done differently, which would have saved lives. And it's not could have been done differently, but nobody did them. Many countries did. South Korea is an example. There are many others. Remember that on February 26th, Donald Trump said, we have 15 cases and 15 is soon going to zero. That was February 26th. We now have almost 3 million cases and 132,000 deaths, and cases are exploding in a huge swath of this country. So that's the context, and it is again evidence that the pandemic and Trump's reaction are dramatically hurting his polling. Now, to zoom out a little bit bigger picture, we continue to get national polling where Trump is down by double digits. We also are seeing Real Clear Politics polling averages in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida, where Biden is ahead by 5 or more points. That's insane. Arizona, which has been a Republican stronghold for a long time, Biden ahead by an average of 3.5. The really crazy thing to think about is that if Donald Trump had just taken medical advice and gone the route of other countries that chose science over ignorance and action over politics, if he had controlled coronavirus and supported a shutdown, supported an actual real testing program starting in January, tracing initiatives, et cetera, et cetera, he would have an all but guaranteed reelection in November. I am increasingly confident that that is how important this is ultimately going to be. And it's also crazy to think that if Trump and Pence had just caught the flu or a bad intestinal bug on January 20th and been MIA for a month and just let medical doctors make decisions, we would also be far better off. In other words, their presence was not only not positive, it was acutely negative in dealing with coronavirus. The data is in the polls. And so what do we all have to do now? Exactly. We don't believe any one of the polls. We imagine that our individual votes could be the difference makers in our states, and every single one of us gets an absentee ballot or goes and votes or does whatever it is that we can do to ensure that Donald Trump is removed in November. The polling looks good. Ignore it. Pretend the polling looks terrible. Pretend every state is 50-50 and that you could be the difference maker.